Hello and welcome to another podcast of Father and Joe. I am Joe Rocky here with Father Boniface Hicks. And today, Father, is our Virtue series continued on justice. And similar to the last one that we just did on hope, I think that the perspective that I have from what justice means outside of the church and what it means to the church are going to be different answers. So before I start talking the wrong things, why don't we start by saying to the church, what does justice mean?
Yes, the virtue of justice, again, virtues are like soul muscles. The word virtue means strength, so it's part of the strength of our soul. Um, Justice is oriented towards doing the good. Actually, all of the virtues ultimately are oriented towards the good. Uh, Prudence has to do with understanding what the good is in a particular situation, and justice has to do with choosing the good, and temperance is has to do with uh, anyway. Fortitude and temperance have to do with choosing the good in more difficult situations, um, and also resisting evil. Anyway, justice, uh, and then a simple way to define justice is to give each what he is due. And then that helps us to understand the different aspects of justice, because there's a different kind of justice that we give to God, that we give to our parents, that we give to our government, that we give to our fellow human beings. And so justice is to give each his due. And so it requires that we actually understand what someone is due. And that's its own thing. And then that we persevere in actually doing that good and giving that person what is his due. So uh, when we talk about these cardinal, we've been talking about the theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, and those have God as their uh, object. Faith in God, hope in God, love for God. Those are the virtues of faith, hope, and love. And then the cardinal virtues, prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance, are actually kind of like packages of virtues. There are other sub virtues, we could say, that fall under them, that have sort of specific applications. But anyway, and so we call them cardinal. Cardinal comes from the word cardo, which means hinge. They're hinge virtues. So we can kind of gather up the other virtues under those titles of prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And the virtue of justice, again, is about giving to each his due. And so if we look at that, what is God's due? What do we owe him? Justice is about paying what we owe, about doing what we are required to do, paying what we owe. So what do we owe God? Well, everything. We owe God everything. So how do we possibly repay God for what he's done for us? It's not possible. We can't possibly give him as much as he has given us. He's given us existence. He's given us life. He's given us everything. We can't give God everything. So the kind of justice that we give to God is its own variety, and we call that religion. Religion is the uh, virtue of justice applied to God. And so, what can we give him? Well, we can give him something important. That's kind of the notion of sacrifice. Can we give him the first fruits of our crop? Can we give him a tithe of our income? Can we give him our time in prayer? Can we give him the sentiments of our hearts? Can we give him first place in our lives? Can we give God something significant and substantial, something meaningful? Ultimately, we give him everything. The martyrs gave God everything. They gave him, in fact, their whole lives. But normally, he wants. He deserves. I should say that he deserves at least our best. at least the first fruits, at least the sacrifice of our time. And and then he's given us this amazing thing. And in the Mass, God actually gave us a sacrifice that is really worthy of him, namely his own sacrifice. Jesus Christ offered himself on the cross, and then he allows us to offer him in the Eucharist. He allows us to renew that sacrifice by participating in the Eucharist. It's the greatest thing we could ever offer God, is God himself, is his own sacrifice that he gave us to offer him. And that's why we say, well, if we're going to talk about keeping a day holy, we have this internal sense, and then it's made explicit in the Ten Commandments that we should make one day holy, and specifically as Christians, we recognize that as being Sunday. If we're going to make a day holy, how could we do that if we're not at least offering him the greatest gift, the greatest sacrifice? If we're not making the greatest act of religion, exercising the greatest act of justice towards God by offering him the Eucharist? It's at least what he deserves. And so we say you can't celebrate Sunday as a holy day. You can't make it a holy day if you haven't at least gone to Mass. God has given us so much. Can't we at least give him an hour in this specific way, offering him that sacrifice that he offered to us? So that's the virtue of religion. That's justice towards God. Maybe I should stop there, and then I can make a comment about the justice toward family and
Sure.
government, called piety, and then justice toward our brothers and sisters.
Sure. So that right there is essentially the most direct answer from the virtue standpoint about why it's important to go to Mass. We have many ways trying to articulate that over the history of this cast, but from the virtue standpoint, that's the most direct reason. As you said, God is worthy of everything, and the fact that he found himself to be a worthy sacrifice, Jesus being the Son of God, that being there in the Mass, you can't really do better than that from that perspective, from the perspective of justice as you just outlined. Again, articulating the importance of being with Christ at the Mass, and that inherently strengthens your virtue of justice and strengthens your relationship with Christ. I was actually just having a conversation the other day of what is the best way to get people to come closer to God. And I kind of stole one of your lines there, Father, which was essentially try it. Just come to the Eucharist. And I didn't have any flowery speech, but Jesus will take care of it from there. Just come and bring the Eucharist back into yourself, and inherently Jesus will take care of it. Now, obviously, there's steps you have to do yourself. Go back to that Hope episode we just did. There are actions you have to do, but being with Christ at the Eucharist is obviously it's about the strongest thing you can do. And as we just discussed there, it's the highest form of justice for God that we can have. So that significantly means a lot. So I didn't want to cut you off as you were going to go down into the other routes that justice applies into our life and how we ought to apply it. But I wanted to highlight that there of how important coming to Mass is and making a day holy for God. It is truly, if you think of it, justice, just in a way that most people don't really think of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So justice towards God, giving God what is his due. Justice is to give each person what is his due. Justice towards God is religion, the virtue of religion. And as you just reiterated very beautifully, going to Mass fundamentally for us who have that opportunity, who know that such a sacrifice exists, such a way to pay back God, to give God the gift of himself, we could say. So, and then justice toward authority And we can think now again about our parents. How can we repay our parents for giving us the gift of life? It's not possible. We can't give them the gift of life. We can't actually give them what they've given us. They've given us something of greater value than we could ever repay to them. And so, what we have toward our parents is what we call the gift of, is the virtue of piety. Piety is the love of a child for parents. And we extend that gift or that virtue, I keep saying gift, we extend that virtue of piety towards other authorities as well. Basically, our government authorities and our maybe teachers and coaches and um, priests and bishops and some of these other authorities in our lives. They're kind of like extensions of parents, we could say. And so that's the virtue of piety, to repay with obedience, a proper obedience, but doing what we're told because it's an authority and we have respect for them. We're paying respect. That's a virtue. And again, if we apply that simple point that I've made many times, virtues are like muscles. The more you use them, the stronger they get. The less you use them, the more they wither. And so when we practice respect, we grow in respect. When we practice obedience, again, we have these mixed feelings about obedience, but just to say a listening, trusting, respect probably is the best way, but actually carrying out someone's will because they're in charge and they deserve the respect of doing what they ask us to do because they're in charge. Now, obviously, that's not a matter of doing immoral things or being stupid about it, but we can be respectful. We can carry out the requests of authority, um, and we can also serve and care for them, and just different ways to show justice to those who have authority over us. Again, starting from our parents and then extending to our starting with our father and extending to our fatherland, to say it that way. Starting with our parents and extending to government and teachers and other forms of authority. So that's the virtue of piety. It's another form of justice, to give to each what they deserve. We tend to have an attitude that's a little bit more anti-authoritarian. I think still in our time, it was even worse in the 60s and 70s, and I think we still carry some of that suspicion and resentment, and we've dethroned all of our leaders by pointing out all of their problems, and we've just anyway come into such an interesting time in the world. But ultimately, the president, the congressmen, the judges, the policemen, those civil authorities deserve respect, and we can't really justify having an attitude of rebellion, having an attitude of disrespect or disregard, or of lying and cheating. And laws are not evil things, and by following the laws and respecting the lawgivers and the law enforcers, it goes a long way. But there's the virtue there, and the more that we do it, the better we get at it as well. And then the last kind of application of the virtue of justice is in regard to our peers. My justice towards you, Joe, is rooted in what you deserve. And likewise to our listeners and to every stranger, every person I meet on the street, in addition to, family members or colleagues or whatever else, each person deserves a lot because every one of us is made in the image and likeness of God. And that's the foundation of the virtue of justice towards our fellow human beings. Each one of us is made with an infinite dignity in the image and likeness of God. And so that's where we get the whole plethora of laws from. Why do we not steal? Why do we not kill people? Why do we not lie? Why do we not covet our neighbor's goods? Why do we not, commit adultery or whatever? Because our neighbor, our fellow human beings, deserve respect. They deserve to be treated as who they are in the image and likeness of God. They deserve their rights, and they deserve to be recognized and revered as sovereign human beings who have their own lives. And so that virtue of justice is at least not to do damage to them. Now, in fact, as Christians, we're called beyond justice, which is to give someone what they deserve. To go beyond that is to give more than they deserve, which is love. None of us deserves love from each other, we could say. To be a little careful about how I say that, but anyway, um, but we can go beyond justice. Going beyond justice is love, but love is built on justice. Love at least gives, first of all, what someone is due, and then gives even more than that freely. So we see a little bit of a continuum there in terms of our human relationships. But that's where our justice system comes in, is ensuring, using the authority of the state to ensure that our relationships with each other follow the path of justice. And again, to not beat each other up and to not kill each other and to not steal each other's things. And we do that for every human being. Nobody is excluded. We do that for every human being because every human being has an infinite dignity, made in the image and likeness of God, and they deserve at least that good to be done to them.
Yeah, and the way that you said that made me think of an example you gave before about how essentially thinking of it as this is the minimum threshold that each person deserves, and doing that is justice, and then exceeding that is love. And the example that you gave before was a married couple who, before they had their first child, were giving each other kind of the minimum they deserved. And then when they had the child, they had to go above and beyond that to be able to care for the child. And you had mentioned that in retrospect, they felt that they were just doing the bare minimums to keep their marriage alive. And it wasn't until they had a baby that they learned how much more you had to do for each other to truly take care of each other. And then they said that their marriage had grown so much in love. And using that as an example, I think that that's just what you articulated right there. At the end of the day, justice and all those civil authorities you mentioned, you have to respect them and all of that. That's part of their due that they have. And going out in open rebellion against them would be the opposite. So one of the things that we've been doing in this virtue series is discussing what the opposite is. So what is the opposite of justice? Because I have a couple of ideas that come to my head, but only one of them can be right. So why don't you just tell me what the right answer of what the opposite of justice really is?
Well, to say it simply, it's crime. Breaking the law. All of the laws are established to ensure justice for every person. Now, our legal system is not perfect, maybe, or whatever, but um, a simple starting point to answer your question, I should say, is crime. Breaking the law is injustice. Injustice is the opposite of justice. Now, that's going to be different things. Not giving God his due. Those kind of sins against religion. And so there's a certain sort of selfishness and apostasy and heresy and different kinds of rebellion. Sins against God obviously are also against justice. In terms of the state, rebellion, revolution, disobedience. Now, again, if the state itself is unjust, then we move into a different category, and
Sure.
likewise
Yeah.
with our parents. If our parents are abusive, then they lose their rights. They don't deserve the same thing. So everything I'm saying is sort of in the ideal of a government that's just and parents that are just, and obviously God is just, so we don't have to worry about that with him. But now, it doesn't mean that we can do injustice against somebody because they're unjust. Two wrongs don't make a right, as they say. But anyway, presuming that the state is just, then obedience, and so disobedience would be against justice. Uh, Interestingly, St. Thomas lists things like hypocrisy. So that's part of justice is making a promise. Uh, our vows to God, your marriage vows, for example, are under the exercise of justice. You've now committed yourself to something, and carrying out your marriage vows is an act of justice. You've committed yourself. Breaking your marriage vows is obviously an act against justice. And so that hypocrisy, saying one thing and doing an opposite thing, or dissimulation is another way of saying, lying under oath, or breaking vows, breaking promises. Um, so even things like flattery and quarreling, covetousness, um, ingratitude. Uh, anyway, these are all different ways against the virtue of justice. But the fundamental thing is, of course, breaking the law, not living out our commitments, um, being unfaithful is going to be against justice.
And all of that in one format or another, if you take it to its conclusion, inevitably leads to chaos.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
and stepping back, as we said there, as you said there, was that God is always just, and that one of the sins against justice there would be not giving God his due. In most directly, and I think probably the most common one seen out there, is not participating in the Mass with him. And I think that that would be a very easy starting point for us to recognize up front, is that missing a Mass is a sin against justice, as you just articulated. So I wanted to kind of give that as a point to it, as you know, ultimately justice is the fulfillment of God in the format of religion, and not practicing a religion is a breaking of justice. So I didn't want to take away your thunder in the final thoughts here, but if you have some final thoughts to give us as we move forward here, going into the rest of our week.
Well, and let me just offer another kind of complementary thing. The virtue of justice is doing good, and I think we identified a lot of different ways that we do that according to what the recipient deserves. The virtue of justice also involves avoiding evil or even resisting evil. So, stopping others from doing evil or stopping evils from existing. And that could be something like the evil of starvation. It's an injustice. Everybody has a right to food, clothing, and shelter. And that's a whole other interesting discussion that we can have that's a little bit foreign to our capitalist thinking. Now, I'm not promoting socialism or communism either, but anyway, letting people starve is an injustice. And so fighting against that is an act of justice. So resisting evil or avoiding evil, because we don't necessarily, avoiding evil is its own action. Doing good is one thing, avoiding evil is potentially a different thing. Sometimes they go together. But anyway, just to put that out there, that our listeners, all of us, can focus, maybe this week on how am I doing good? How am I avoiding evil? How could I do that better?
Sure, and I definitely like how you put that there, and that's a good task for us to think about and sit in our hearts as we move forward. So again, we thank everyone for listening, and we will be again here with you next week.